Let me introduce the first speaker, who is Dr. John Gilbert. And Dr. Gilbert is spent a whole career in the field of food science and food technology and food safety. Dr. Gilbert was formerly the science director of the Central Science Laboratory in the UK, near York in England. And he just recently retired from CSL and has founded a new company called Food Life International, and he's a founding partner of that company. Food Life International is a company that is really dedicated to consulting and training people like yourselves and helping you with analytical problems, whether they're involving risk management or project management or science and scientific publications, for example. Dr. Gilbert is well accredited and well experienced in publications. He has over 190 scientific publications, edited I think about 4 books. He's also the editor-in-chief of a journal called Food Additives and Contamination. So he is very well qualified to make the presentation this morning. In addition, Dr. Gilbert you'll see, is very, very active in the European Union and the European Commission. And that's very important because all of us in the world look to the European Union for setting the highest standards in food safety and food quality, especially when it comes to public health or food imports and food exports. And at Thermo Fisher, we have quite a bit of experience with food imports and exports out of Korea. And the same is true with Dr. Gilbert, because the European Union, as I said, sets a very high standard. And today, around the world, we all refer to the European Union as the gold standard for food safety and for food testing. And you'll see why as we go through the day. Dr. Gilbert has also been very instrumental in doing training for the European Union around the world, and it's always a challenge to keep track and find out where he is, because he's never in the same place in 2 weeks in a row. So he has a lot of international experience. So with that, it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. John Gilbert.
Thank you for that introduction, Stuart, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You saw from the program this morning that you've got a day that's full of some very interesting technical presentations telling you how to tackle a lot of these very demanding problems in food safety. What I would like to do, because I know that you come from a variety of different backgrounds, what I would like to do is really set the scene and give you an overview of food safety. So my presentation isn't going to be really that technical. What I'd like to do to start with is to spend the first half of my presentation talking in fairly general terms about food safety, trying to introduce the subject to you and explain really why we're doing what we're doing. Then I'd like to go through each of the areas of chemical contaminants and residues one by one. And for each area, I'd like to tell you what the issue is, why we're concerned with a particular area. I'd like to explain what the scientific challenges are in the laboratory, why these areas are particularly demanding. But at the same time, I want to mention the business challenge, because increasingly it's not just about can we solve this problem, it's about the cost of solving it, it's about the speed with which we do the analysis, which are the business drivers. Then I'd like to do a quick SWOT analysis comparing screening techniques with instrumental analysis, and then try to draw all of this together. I think it's quite helpful actually if we start by defining what we're talking about with food safety. So what we're not talking about is food security. You sometimes hear people using the term food security when actually they mean safety. Now, food security is about ensuring a plentiful supply of food. So food security is about ensuring we have enough food. It's not related to safety at all. But of course for government, food security is the first responsibility. Safety comes a little bit second after that. So we mustn't confuse security and safety. The other word I'm going to use and explain a bit, and it'll come up several times, is economic fraud, food fraud. Now food fraud is about deceiving the consumer. So it's about trying to make the consumer pay more for food than it's actually worth. Now in the area of food fraud, sometimes when there's deliberate adulteration, like melamine, it becomes a food safety issue. But in some cases of food fraud, it's simply that the food is mislabeled. So if I have a low quality food, but I label it to deceive you and make you think it's a higher quality, that's food fraud. But the subject of our seminar today actually is food safety. And this is quite a reasonable definition, where safety is about ensuring that food is free from microbiological or chemical contaminants or residues that might cause harm to human health. So it's about causing harm to health for things that are present in food. But the words I want you to focus on here are the words food is free from, because this is absolutely critical when we try to understand why we set standards and why we have regulations. Now, if I go out into the street and I talk to somebody who's not a scientist and I ask them what they expect from food that's free from organisms or free from contaminants, their expectation will be that that food contains no microorganisms at all. They expect food to be sterile. Or if I ask them what they understand by free of chemical contaminants, they would expect that you couldn't detect any contaminant in that food. Well, of course, if you use that expectation for what is safe food, it's almost impossible to provide food to the consumer, because it's impossible to provide sterile food and food that's absolutely free from any contaminant or residue. So if we realise that this is an unrealistic expectation, it brings us back again to what do we mean from food is free from. And of course what we mean is that we have to set standards or levels which constitute what is safe and what is not safe. So the business of risk managers in food safety is to derive these standards or maximum residue limits or maximum limits. So the regulations that define safe food are the work of the risk manager. Now the risk manager takes advice from scientists. The risk manager takes advice from toxicologists to try to understand the risks involved with exposure to contaminants and residues. But at the same time, the risk manager has to listen to industry, has to listen to agriculture, because it's a balance between what's technically possible and feasible and what's desirable in terms of absolute protection. So the job of the risk manager is to exercise this judgment, balancing the two things. And when you balance them, you end up with these standards, which hopefully become international standards and hopefully provide a consistent level playing field for trade and for food safety. Now it's worth reflecting on the stakeholders in food safety. Now traditionally, government has had the primary responsibility for food safety, but within government there's usually a number of different organisations. So in government there's usually some body like a Ministry of Agriculture that's responsible for farming. There's usually a Ministry of Environment, a Ministry of Health, a ministry or department that looks after the interests of the food industry. So there's a number of organisations that are looking after production as well as food safety. And the problem with this is that you often end up with some conflict of interest, because the same department responsible both for the consumer's safety and for production has some difficulties dealing with these conflicting issues. And I can illustrate this very easily in the UK when 15 years ago or more we had a problem with BSE, mad cow disease. And on the television the Minister of Agriculture appeared and made an announcement to the general public saying beef is safe. He appeared on television to reassure the public that it was perfectly safe to eat beef because there were a lot of stories about this problem. And then 2 weeks later, or 3 weeks later, the Minister of Health appeared on television saying, I think there's a problem with beef. There could be a problem in terms of a disease in animals and a disease in humans. And the consumer doesn't know then who to believe. There's conflicting messages coming from different parts of government. So it really doesn't work having each of these departments with responsibility for safety. And therefore, in Europe and across the world now, independent agencies have been established who take responsibility for food safety. So in the UK, we now have the Food Standards Agency, that is an independent body that looks after food safety. And there's similar organisations in most of the EU member states. There's a similar organisation at European level, known as EFSA, European Food Safety Authority. So independent agencies generally are now taking responsibility to avoid this conflict of interest. The food producers, of course, also have an interest in safety. Food producers want a consistent standard to work to. They want to be able to show their food is safe. So all of these parties have interest in establishing standards and regulations. If I go into a supermarket in the UK or in Korea or anywhere and I want to buy a food product, really all I see when I go into the shop is this product in a packaging material here, and I know nothing about the history of that food product. This is chili powder that I'm buying, and when I buy that, the only confidence I have in the quality or safety really resides in the reputation of the manufacturer. I look at that label and I recognise the name of the company and I say to myself, this is a good company, I can trust this company is producing safe food. And I really have to have this confidence in the reputation. I don't want to buy this chili powder only to find at some later date that it was dried by the roadside here and contaminated with lead and PAH and various other contaminants. I don't want to find it was dried in a primitive oven somewhere in Africa. So I have to trust the company here. And similarly, if I'm buying a tomato product, I want that tomato product to come from first quality, top quality tomatoes, not from reject tomatoes. And the only confidence I can have in that product resides in the label, in the brand reputation. So for industry, brand reputation and demonstrating quality is important. I'm drawing a number of strands together here, and you'll see why in a minute, but the next one I want to draw in is the fact that in food safety, we no longer think of segments of food safety. We have to think about food safety as an integrated whole. So often now you hear people talking about farm to fork, an integrated food chain. And the reason they do that is that you can't just concentrate on the end of the food chain and focus on the packaged product. If you have responsibility for selling a food product, you have to know everything about the history of that food product. And the reason is that the food chain is really a closed loop system, and everything that goes on in that closed loop will impact on the finished product. So if there's environmental contamination where you're growing that crop, inevitably you'll get contamination of the food product. If you're discharging into the water supply, if you're disposing irresponsibly of waste material, there's a risk of contamination of food. And when we're using chemicals as pesticides or as veterinary drugs here, we're not losing them, they're not disappearing from the system. Those compounds or metabolites or degradation products remain in the system, and inevitably there's a risk of them ending up as contaminants in food. So we have to look at the whole of the food chain as an integrated food chain, and we have to concern ourselves with all the parts of that food chain. Now, I can illustrate this in the case of mycotoxins. Now, these are mold metabolites that are present in food. Now we could focus at the end of the food chain here. So if I'm producing bread, I could simply focus on the bread, and I can look at the way I've produced it and feel confident it's not contaminated with mycotoxins. But the fact is that that bread is made from flour which is made from wheat, and the wheat can be contaminated with fusarium mold right at the beginning of the food chain. So we can have infection, and we can have deoxynivalenol, nivalenol, we can have zearalenone present in the wheat growing in the field. When it's subsequently harvested and dried, there's a risk of infection with another mold, a risk of other mycotoxins being present, and so forth through the food chain. And if those cereals are badly stored prior to milling, you can get infection with a different fungus, and you can get ochratoxin A present. So that bread that you're producing may well have a number of mycotoxins present in it, which reflect the history of the bread, what happened to the cereals, what happened to the wheat. And this applies to all of the mycotoxins. So we can't just focus on the end of the chain, we have to look at the integrated whole. Finally, I want to bring into the equation the consumers as stakeholders in food safety. And in Europe, certainly, consumers have now demanding, or they've become accustomed to having access to seasonal products throughout the year. So historically, in the UK, you only used to be able to buy strawberries in July for 3 weeks. Now the consumer expects to find strawberries in the shops nearly every month of the year. And the only way that the food industry can satisfy this demand is to buy strawberries from around the world and import them. So increasingly we're having foods imported from around the world to meet this demand for seasonal products. The consumers also very much focused on cost. They're looking for low price of food. It means the food industry now, instead of simply buying from a few kilometres away from where the foods are being sold, the food industry is going around the world to source and buy its food. So again, coming back to the UK, we have chickens from Thailand, we have seafood from Thailand, chickens from China, chickens from Brazil, we have apples coming from New Zealand, we have fresh and exotic fruits from around the world. So food is no longer just coming locally and at one time of the year, it's coming from right around the world, and it's out of season in terms of availability. And this means that the food chain that we were talking about has become much longer. The food chain is no longer a few hundred kilometres, it's thousands of kilometres, which means that control over the food chain is much more difficult. This also means that a lot more analytical work, a lot more testing has to be undertaken. So we now establish that there's a need for regulatory limits, there's a need for consistent standards for trade to ensure that food is both safe and to ensure that you can have a level playing field in terms of trading of foods. But when you're trading with foods halfway around the world, you need to test before you export. So increasingly analytical work is carried out on raw materials before foods are exported. You don't want to send a consignment of food from Korea to